Wonderful. So thank you so much. I'm really thrilled to be here, and thanks to the American Institutes for Research and NCII for inviting me to join them in this incredible series on error analysis. So if you haven't already had the opportunity, I hope that you will get a chance to explore the other two fantastic webinars done in the domains of reading and math. And today I'm excited to follow up in writing. This is my contact information, and I'll show it again at the end of the webinar. So really happy to continue the conversation outside of this and hear from you on all the incredible things that you're doing in the field, in your practice, or on in your own research areas. So today we're going to start, I'm going to talk through, like I said, an error analysis framework used in writing. I'll begin by providing a really brief overview and contextualizing it within the context of database individualization, and what error analysis means for that process. And then I hope to answer, or at least start to address, three really common questions that come up in practice. So, questions about, well, how do I actually get a student's writing sample? What do the data show about a student's writing sample? And then, how I can use a certain framework for that, which I'll introduce midway through the webinar. And then, probably most importantly, what are the implications of this for instruction? And at the end, we'll have a really brief time for an awesome resource that NCII will be putting out shortly related to this. So database individualization, if you're at all familiar with DBI or NCII's work in this area, you've probably seen this graphic before. If you're not, I highly encourage you to check out the amazing resources that they've put out about this process. But just to set the stage for everyone joining us today, I'm defining database individualization, or DBI, as a way of making the process of reviewing student data and adjusting instruction based on that data. So this may be in the context of intensifying supports for interventions, like NCII has done a lot of work in. You can also think about it in the context of just adjusting instruction, even at the tier one level. So I'll encourage you to think about that today, particularly in the domain of writing, even though we'll be looking at through this in a lens of individualization and really individual student work samples, how this may apply for larger groups of students at the classroom or even grade level. The DBI process laid out here involves implementing an intervention or instruction program, engaging in some sort of progress monitoring assessment to ascertain the student's response to that, and then figuring out if they're responsive or not responsive through a process of diagnostic data of what do we need to do next. So the diagnostic data section is really where we'll focus on our time today, and understanding how do these interventions need to be targeted with specific skills. Another way to think about that error analysis piece that happens in the diagnostic step is thinking about it in terms of how do we move from calculating scores from a student to actually identifying and building their skills. I think this is especially relevant in a domain like writing, where a writing sample of a student often can get boiled down to a single rubric score or a number, a spelling score, or even a very general judgment about a student's writing. This is a really great writer. This is a really struggling writer. And so the purpose of this error analysis is really to use a framework to move from just looking at scores and numbers to specific skills that connect to evidence-based instruction. All right, so here's where we'll get into kind of the actual process of doing it. I mentioned earlier that these are common questions that come up related to working with students writing data. And one of the most common ones, believe it or not, is, well, where do I actually get student writing sample from? Many educators are familiar with assessment practices, and systems are built to gather reading assessments like oral reading fluency or even math assessments at regular intervals. This is not always the case in writing. And so today I'm going to talk about this within the context of collecting a student writing sample through a curriculum-based measure in writing. So I mentioned oral reading fluency being a reading curriculum-based measure. You may also be familiar with some of their versions in math as well. So these exist in writing also. CBMs, curriculum-based measures in writing, are usually based around a prompt, and the student is given a set time for writing. So they're typically brief, times 3 to 5 minutes per writing session. I'll talk about a slightly longer one where we gave students 15 minutes to write today. But the point is that it's something that can be written in a single setting. It's not assigning an essay that's written over a month or a whole unit, but it's rather that brief administered piece. And they often have quantitative scoring methods that go along with them. These CBMs in writing are really flexible by grade level and genre, so they can be given across multiple genres. We have curriculum-based measures from all the little ones down in kindergarten all the way through high school. And they are from this family of curriculum-based measures, so they are designed to be administered multiple times and detect that change over time. So I'll briefly share a couple of examples of these. Again, this is really just to kind of set the foundation of, well, where could I get that writing sample to conduct the error analysis with? Um, so even with the younger grades, those early writers, we have some really excellent examples of curriculum-based measures in writing. So I'm going to credit here Erica McMaster, or excuse me, Kristen McMaster and Erica Lemke's work on the early writing project. So this is kind of an adaptation of some of their work from there, but just to give you an idea of what types of assessments you can be giving even with your youngest writers. Some of them are related to more just writing single words. A word dictation task looks familiar to a traditional spelling test that you might think of, where a teacher reads a word out loud and the student is asked to write that word. It's scored a little bit more differently, a little bit more nuanced than just a right or wrong, but that is one option for these. On my slide, I have an example here of a version of picture word. So this is a task in which a student is presented with a picture and a word that labels that picture. So the examples here are tree and shirt, and the student is asked to write one sentence containing that target word. And these are scored in various ways, looking at spelling or number of words written. And these are just kind of at the sentence level. We also do want to measure students writing connected text at the passage level too. So that's where the story prompt piece comes in. These look like giving a student a quick story starter, maybe a sentence stem or a question about a story that they would write. And they're given that, 3 to 5 minutes to write a story, often the narrative genre for that. I will be showing an example from a lot of the work that I've done on the writing architect assessment. So this is an example that shows how students can use a source-based piece to engage in writing. So they read first an article, and then they're given 15 minutes to write an informational paper about that article that they just read. So again, I won't go into too much depth on the logistics of administering this, but it's brief. It can be given in multiple genres, and this version can be certainly typed or handwritten. So the next kind of question is, all right, I got a writing sample. How do I score it? This is how I would like to set the foundation for our error analysis today. So you may be thinking, well, an error analysis may not be as quantitative as some of these other scoring measures, but I want to kind of encourage you to think about the utility of having these sort of counts of data that we'll use to illustrate how we can build that more robust error analysis on top of this. So there are lots of different ways to score curriculum-based measures in writing. I am an advocate of the correct minus incorrect word sequences scoring procedure, and I'll give a very brief overview of it here because it will be a foundation piece for our error analysis in a moment. So CIWS, or correct minus incorrect word sequences, is a way of accounting for a student's total production and the accuracy in that production of their writing. And it's based around the idea of a writing sequence. And the writing sequence is the connection between two adjacent pieces of writing. So, two words or a word and a punctuation mark. And in this type of scoring, we are looking for accuracy or correctness in spelling, capitalization, punctuation, and the semantics or the meaning of certain words within the sentence. So the example on the screen here is he wants to make his family happy. So the first step is to identify the word sequences. And so this writing sequence here begins here. He is spelled correctly and capitalized correctly, so we put a green caret to indicate that that's correct. The next sequence is in between these two words. He and wants are both spelled correctly and used correctly, so that's a green caret. We keep going, wants and to. When we get to the sequence in between to and make, you see that make is not accurately spelled, and so that's indicated with a red X. That's an incorrect sequence. The sequence between make and his is also incorrect because make is still spelled incorrectly. And we keep moving along his family. Those are both spelled correctly and used correctly. Happy family. And then we add another sequence between happy and the final punctuation mark. So the score for correct minus incorrect word sequences just counts up the number of green carets. So that's 6 minus the number of red X's or incorrect sequences. That's 2. And the CIWS score is 4. This is a really important scoring measure to know about because it does have the highest correlations to other types of writing measures like state tests that we commonly use in research, meaning that it has the highest criterion validity when we compare it to other scoring procedures. And that is true from grades K through 12. So no matter which type of assessment you're giving, CIWS is a helpful one to know about. There's one other scoring procedure that I'll talk about before we jump into our error analysis piece, and that is this scoring procedure called TIDE. Um, while CIWS is great, it does not account for the structure of a paragraph. It does not account for the ideas that a student is using. It doesn't account for whether or not they copied a lot of it or how sophisticated their interpretations are. And that's where something like a genre or structure-based rubric can come in. So I'll be talking today about a structure for the informational genre called TIDE. And this structure indicates that an informational paragraph should have a topic sentence, an idea that relates to that topic sentence, a detail that really elaborates or extends that idea, and then an ending or a conclusion statement. So this is a very useful structure used in assessment and also instruction, which I'll talk about towards the end of our presentation. But here's an example just to give you an idea of how to use it in assessment. I've highlighted here the different elements of that informational genre. So you can see here that this student has included all 4 elements. There's a red, yellow, green, and blue highlight on here. And so you can use this in your error analysis, as we will in a few moments, to kind of understand how this student has mastered this particular genre. TIDE scoring also has strong correlations with other valued measures of writing that we use, and so it's a good one for decision making in that assessment piece.
Katie,
Yes.
we had a quick question in the chat before we go on. Are there norms for the types of CVMs, like oral reading fluency?
Excellent question. There are norms, and they're kind of depending on which assessment that you're using. There are certain sort of programs or curriculum that have developed their own norms. So the early writing project for those grades K through 3 have norms for a number of their measures. I believe that AimsWeb has some published norms for correct word sequences, which is related to the CIWS piece that I shared about. And I think those norms go up through at least eighth grade, I want to say off the top of my head. So there are norms available for them. We won't really be using that for today's work because we'll really be jumping into this more individualized piece. But excellent question. Anything else, Paul, that came up?
Oh, that's it. Thanks.
Great. Okay, thanks. Okay, so we've got that writing sample, and this is where we're really going to get into the meat of today's presentation. So what do these data actually show about a student's skills? And I presented that graphic earlier on in the presentation that showed we're trying to move from scores into skills, and this is where that bridge can kind of happen. So I'll present a framework today I'm calling the levels of language, and the idea is to break down this giant construct of writing into these different components of it. And this is a framework that's really reflected in a lot of our leading theories of writing at the moment. It's also supported by empirical research, but I find it to be extremely accessible for use in practice as well. So that's why this has been guiding a lot of my recent work. So today we're going to be looking at those errors in the student's writing sample. We're going to expand on the curriculum-based measure scoring system. So we'll look at those correct sequences and those incorrect sequences and identify what level of language they fall into, and then how that connects to instruction. So the levels of language identifies four different levels, components of writing that all come together to make what we consider a written composition. The smallest one is at the subword level. So this considers transcription pieces. So you can look at students' handwriting or typing. The subword is then used to kind of build this word level of language. So looking at students' spelling, their vocabulary and word choice, and then some of the mechanics related to that, like capitalization. At the sentence level, which is made up of those words, you can look for punctuation, looking at the semantics and the meaning, and then looking at how students structure their sentences, how complex they are, how accurate they are. And then finally, that big zoomed out piece at the text level. So looking at whether or not all those elements that we would expect to see in a certain genre are there, how well structured it is, the organization and the kind of the cohesion of those ideas. So I hope that you're kind of seeing those already related to what we looked at in our um, curriculum-based measure scoring procedures earlier. We're going to take a look at these more in depth. So the first step is to administer and score that writing probe. So this is a new example. We're going to work with this case study today. This is a informational paragraph written by a fourth grade student, and they read an article about polar bears and were asked to write this informational paragraph in response. So first I scored it for CIWS, the correct minus incorrect word sequences. So you can see that on the side of the screen with those carets and those X's. And just overall, you can see there are a number of incorrect sequences. And we have a number score, which is 40 CIWS, but we want to know, well, what does this actually mean about the student's skills? So we're going to take a deep dive into what those X's are indicating. On the other side of the screen, I've scored it for tied. So looking at those genre elements. And again, off the bat, the student looks like they've included kind of all of those different elements, but we'll look a little bit more deeply at them in a moment. Okay, step two is to consider the subword level. So this is transcription. So we'll want to look at a student's handwriting or typing, depending on what method of transcription they are using. There are a number of different measures that you can use in your practice for this. If you're looking at handwriting, there are normed measures through the Wyatt Achievement Test for alphabet writing fluency. I believe those norms only go up through fourth grade, but it's still a task that you could use with older students if you wanted to look at sort of individual growth over time. I've mentioned the early writing project quite a bit. They have a similar task with those early norms as well. And the gist of these is that it kind of counts the number of characters a student writes correctly in 1 minute. Um, if your students are typing, and I hope that they are, there are free typing fluency tasks online. So I've been recommending typing.com as a free option for a lot of teachers. So these tasks also are kind of like a copy task where students need to type as many characters as they can in a set amount of time. And if you don't have access to these, or if you're doing this, more quickly on the fly, you can also certainly just observe a student's handwriting and their typing. So we have some really nice handwriting norms out there that I've put up on the screen here. So this is from a study that Graham and colleagues did back in the 90s, but they looked at 900 students from grades 1 through 9 and developed these handwriting norms here. So these are correct characters per minute on a copy task. And the rule of thumb for typing is that your typing speed should really be similar to your handwriting speed throughout development. So that's what we're using right now for making a lot of these decisions on handwriting pieces and typing pieces. But we'll talk a little bit more about this in the instructional component. All right, so after you consider transcription, right, that's the important piece of levels of language that isn't necessarily in the final writing sample, but it certainly contributes to it. We're going to look at our writing samples for the word level. So we'll start by looking at spelling. Um, Sometimes spelling can be considered a subword level skill, but we're going to talk about it as these word pieces. And I'll talk about three different types of errors that we're going to look for. So spelling can be considered in a number of ways, but it's much more helpful to break down what type of spelling error it is, rather than just saying the student struggles with spelling, because it has important implications for how it's instructed. So there are three types of spelling errors that encourage you to look for in your student's writing sample. The first being a phonological spelling error. So phonological spelling is based on this idea that phonemes or sounds build words. And when you're looking in your student's writing sample for this, you can look for either added or missing sounds that are present in the writing. So the example I have is actually with the word example highlighted in blue on this student sample here. So you can see this student wrote the word example and missing the sound and the letter M for example. That's an example of a phonological spelling error where that sound was missing. Orthographic spelling errors are related to the structure or the rules of a written language. So you'll want to look for where there are certain misrepresented structures. So at different vowel combinations, different ways to make the E sound, for example. If you use the wrong one, that can be considered an orthographic error. Importantly, these may be phonologically plausible, right? They may actually sound correct. I've been reading some writing samples lately that I've had to read out loud because when I read them out loud, I can hear what the student meant to say. But there are many, many, many orthographic errors. So even though they're phonologically plausible, they're not spelled accurately because of that orthography piece. So the examples of orthographic errors that I've highlighted on here are in green. So one of them is the example survive. So this is missing a silent E, which is one of the structural rules of English writing. So when it's missing the silent E, we're considering that an orthographic error. The next one is blubber, and the last one is trapped. Both of these are missing a doubled consonant when a suffix was added on there, so resulting in a spelling error. Again, they can be phonologically plausible, even though this one would probably be read as traped because it doesn't have that doubled piece. So they're missing that rule. And then finally, morphological errors, which can also be sort of related to that orthographic piece as well. But these are based on the idea that morphemes are those units that carry meaning. So thinking about your base words, prefixes, suffixes, plural markers, these morphemes can change the way that a word is used in a sentence. So they can change it into different tenses. They can change it from a verb to a noun. Um, there are lots of different ways of manipulating these words based on adding or subtracting morphemes. So these all come with rules as well. So with morphological errors, you'll want to look for errors that students are making in combining those base words with those different morphemic pieces. So prefixes, suffixes, tenses, or forms. The examples that I have on this slide are highlighted in this kind of reddish color. So let's see, bodies help them survive in the freeze Arctic. So this student has not used the adjective verb of this. This should say freezing. They did not add the suffix ing on the end of that. So that may be a piece that they may need some additional instruction in. And then in this version down here, this example, it keeps their body heat trapped inside so they don't freeze. This makes polar bear the perfect animals for the coldest place on Earth. So this is an example of where there's sort of that non-agreement between subject and verb. This should say this makes, and the student wrote this make. So again, different examples. Of course, this is not exhaustive, but I do really like these three categories for breaking down spelling even further, which connects it directly to instruction.
Katie,
Yeah.
could you briefly remind us why there's an X before and after a misspelled word?
Wonderful. Yep. So before and after, these are indicating the incorrect sequences in that other scoring procedure. So we wanted to look at the space between two words, and if the word is spelled incorrectly, then that sequence or space between them is going to be incorrect. And similarly on the other side of that word. So it's a helpful thing to know when you're looking in this error analysis. If you've done that CIWS scoring, you can look for those words that have an X on either side of a word, which likely means that that's probably a misspelled word.
Thanks.
Great. These are excellent questions. The CIWS scoring procedure is really technically tricky. And I think once you get the hang of it, it comes a lot more naturally, but these are really helpful clarifications. Thank you. The word level has another component to it outside of spelling, and one that's very, very important, vocabulary. So typically in an open response written language sample, like a student's paragraph that they write, vocabulary is often not measured through an expected list of words, but instead we're looking for just sort of the complexity and the variety of word choice that that student has used. Really importantly, we want to look for vocabulary as something different than spelling. So we want to provide students feedback on both aspects of word writing. So we'll provide them feedback on their spelling, like we just looked at, but we also don't want to penalize or dissuade students from using certain words just because they don't know how to spell them yet. So we're going to look at vocabulary, but again, not pay attention to that spelling piece and just consider, is the student have a nice complexity and variety in their word choice, and where could they grow in that? Some things that I really like to look for on here are the use of connective words. So because, however, for example, those can really help make that student's writing more sophisticated. They also can help indicate some components of the genre that we'll talk about, which are those are pretty teachable things to ask students to add into their writing. You can also look for how students are using different morphemes to change forms of a word. So if a student learns the word transport as a verb, and then they learn that you can add on this ending for transportation to use it as a noun, they now have two different words that they can use in their writing using that morpheme piece. So again, this will connect to that instruction piece, but I wanted to just highlight to look for that. All right, so we're moving on to the sentence level. We've looked at the subword, the word, and now the sentence level. And this will be considering punctuation and syntax. So looking at sentence structures and thinking about what builds a sentence. So sentences are, of course, made up of words, but they're made up of words with specific functions, and those build clauses. So clauses build sentences, and they can be manipulated and reordered to change the type of sentence or the complexity of sentence. So in our writing sample, we're going to be looking for either missing words or word endings, so like verb tenses that are incorrect in there. We'll also be looking for different types of sentence structures. And then by the end of upper elementary school, especially, we really want to see an increasingly complex structure that students are using. So the rule of thumb is by the end of upper elementary school, written language should be more complex than spoken language. So you can kind of use that as sort of just a guide for assessing where is the student's complexity in their sentence structure as compared to what I would expect. So in our example about polar bears on here, we're going to look at the word sequences again that are marked with those X's, those incorrect pieces, to kind of clue us into where there might be some errors. A number of these were spelling errors in the example that we looked at, but we can certainly find some examples here. So at the beginning, this is more related to sentence complexity. So, polar bears have special bodies. The bodies help them survive in the freezing Arctic. There's technically no sentence level error in this. They did a really nice job with having all the components of the sentence. They have punctuation in their sentences, which is really exciting to see. But we could help this student kind of increase the complexity of their sentence by combining the first two sentences. So, for example, it could read, polar bears have special bodies that help them survive in the freezing Arctic. At the end of the passage, I've highlighted another possible sentence error, and this was just from a missing punctuation mark, which contributes to a run-on sentence in this case. So the student could maybe use some more instruction punctuation. We're not seeing a major pattern in their writing on that, so we'll come to that in our kind of prioritization of these goals, but it is something to note. So you would see the missing punctuation indicated by these double X's here. So I didn't really talk about this rule in our scoring, brief overview of the scoring procedure, but I'll read the sentence. This is like a sleeping bag and it keeps their body heat trapped inside so they don't freeze. There should be a period here. So if you imagine a period between those two X's, there are two incorrect sequences, and that's telling us, oop, this student was probably missing something from this. Because the period, we're going to consider that a sentence level error related to punctuation. Okay, wrapping up our error analysis, we're coming in on the last level. So we've done subword, word, sentence, and now the text level, looking at that structure of their overall writing. So the text level, again, looks at those elements that we would expect to see in that genre and not the spelling or the grammar. We paid attention to those in our sentence level errors and our word level errors, and we certainly will provide feedback and instruction as needed there. But this also provides a really nice opportunity for students to showcase the skills that they have at this text level or discourse level in the complexity of their ideas, including a topping sentence, including an ending, even if they're not the best spellers. So in this, we're going to look for how each element is included or not included, kind of the cohesion of those elements or the relevance to one another or the prompt. We'll go back to connective words because those are very important for indicating genre. And then we'll also look at the complexity or the sophistication of those elements. So here's our example. Again, our polar bear piece. So I've highlighted here according to this TIDE structure. So as a reminder, TIDE standing for topic, idea, detail, ending. And this is used as one example of how you can structure an informational paragraph. So the topic sentence here, polar bears have special bodies. The bodies help them survive in the freezing Arctic. Um, One, it's multiple sentences, but both kind of function as this topic element together. So you may want to kind of take note of that. These may not be sentence-based, but rather they're idea-based. They have the next piece is the idea that follows up on that. For example, they have a thick layer of fat under their skin called blubber, plus two layers of heavy fur. And then I highlighted in green the detail. This is like a sleeping bag and it keeps their body heat trapped inside so they don't freeze. And finally, the ending. This makes polar bears the perfect animals for the coldest place on Earth. So this student has done a really lovely job of including all four of those elements in here, which is a real strength of their writing. I also think that they have a really nice kind of added sophistication that in this green detail. Not only does the detail add on about this thick layer of fat under their skin, gives a little bit more information. It also, I think, adds a really nice interpretive piece. They compare it to a sleeping bag and talk about why that's important. So, you can highlight these and just consider them present or not present. But especially for older students or students who've been working on this as an instructional goal, you may also consider adding a little bit of a rubric score along with it. So maybe they get a score of 1 if the topic is present, and they get a score of 2 if it's present and really sophisticated or special or nuanced in some way. All right, so putting it all together, levels of language error analysis. So we've gone through our levels of language. We have the subword, word, sentence, and text levels that we looked at. We had that curriculum-based measure score that included both a handwriting and typing observation of that student. We scored for correct minus incorrect word sequences and identified 12 word level incorrect word sequences that were related to spelling. We identified 4 incorrect word sequences that were related to sentence level pieces. So that was a missing word and a missing punctuation mark. And then we also identified those tied elements in their writing. Just kind of noting some of the patterns that we saw. We didn't get to see the student, but in the observation, the student's teacher noted that their typing fluency was slower than their handwriting. When we looked at that word level error analysis, they had multiple orthographic spelling errors with that double consonant piece. They also had some morphological errors and phonological errors, so spelling seems like it might be a thing we want to focus on for instruction. And then at the sentence level, they had one missing word and one missing punctuation mark, but nothing appeared as a pattern or more than once in there. And so, something that we might just consider continuing to support. And then for their structure, that text level piece, they had all 4 elements there. Some of them were nicely sophisticated. They had some connective words, like for example, in there as well, which were all really helpful to see. Next, we're going to talk about this instructional goals. So what does this actually mean on this last column? Okay. The beautiful thing about the levels of language framework is that we use it in our assessment, like we did with the error analysis, and it translates directly into instructional goals and instruction. So we can use the same framework to think about instruction. We'll talk first about subword level and we'll go all the way through text level. So at the subword level, thinking about transcription, just kind of general best practices. We do recommend that explicit instruction in handwriting and typing for students even into like the middle school grades is really important. So for handwriting, this can look like things like presenting letter formation paths, like this example on the side of the slide here. For typing, we really encourage students to engage in learning the home row method, so touch typing and getting instruction with lots of practice opportunities. Typing.com is another example of that as well. And then for the handwriting program, I have this little example here is from Steve Graham and Karen Harris's Castle handwriting program, which is available, includes this very structured sequence of what letters you learn in a certain order with lots of practice opportunities of individual letters and writing letters within words as well. At the word level, you want to teach both spelling and vocabulary. So for vocabulary, the research is really supporting the use of things like concept maps or a Freyer model. and really teaching that vocabulary in context. So the bottom of my slide here has just a very brief example of what a Freire model can look like, involving the term or the vocabulary word, explicitly defining that word, writing out some facts or characteristics related to that term, and then examples and non-examples of it. So that's one way to make the definition of a word and the meaning of a word very, very explicit, and then practice using it in context. Morphology instruction. So that's learning the bases, base words, the affixes, suffixes, prefixes, things like Greek and Latin roots, is also really, really helpful for that vocabulary piece. Morphology can also integrate spelling as well. So morphology instruction has effects on both the student's spelling and vocabulary development. So it's a really, really powerful tool that we have to kind of get both of those word level pieces together. When you're teaching spelling, thinking about explicit teaching of those orthographic rules. So especially when you end a morpheme to a word, so that rule of doubling the last consonant when you add a suffix. This particular student we looked at struggled in, is one example of that. And then finally, I want to encourage everyone to actually explicitly teach students a strategy for planning to use certain language in their writing. So this can really help students identify what those essential words are as they're reading and what those essential words to use in their writing will be. So if you have a student read a passage or read an article or use some sort of source, or other form of media for their writing, um, you can teach students how to identify which words they want to pull out and use in their own writing. One really practical way of doing this is by adding a language box somewhere on the graphic organizer that you're teaching students. So if you're teaching the tied structure and you have a graphic organizer that includes a T, I, a D, and an E, you can add a language box or an L at the bottom of that and have students jot down the actual words they want to use in their writing, for their actual drafting of their paper. So really practical tool. A lot of teachers have reported back to me that that has been really, really a helpful addition to practices that they're already using for the word level. At the sentence level, instruction in punctuation and syntax. So students should be receiving explicit instruction in sentence formation. One of my favorite pieces here is related to just what are the components of a sentence, right? Every sentence has a subject and a verb. And I recently learned about the who and the do in a sentence, which is again just a really quick and fun way to remind students does this sentence have a who and a do? Does it have those two parts? Another way to practice this is through tasks like sentence repeating, sentence combining, or sentence expanding. And the idea there is that you learn those connective words, and have two sentences, connect them with a connective, which creates a more complex sentence. So the research is really supportive of that and kind of increasing that complexity of those sentences as well. At the text level, so this is again that structure piece. We really encourage teachers to be teaching multiple genres using genre-specific text structures. So you don't need to feel like you need to teach it all, but start with one structure per genre. So, for example, in the informational genre, I really like the tied structure that I presented on today. It seems to be a nice general one that fits a lot of informational writing. So, making sure that your students have the topic, idea, detail, and ending. This can be expanded. You could have a topic, idea, detail, ending, or even more ideas in that as well. But having those, at least those four elements, is really, really powerful for that student structural writing. If you're teaching the persuasive genre, you can teach the tree structure, so tell, reason, end it, and explain. And then the narrative structure, C space is what's being really used out there. So making sure that you identify character, setting, purpose, action, conclusion, and emotion. And again, these are teaching structures, not necessarily writing processes, but they can certainly be integrated with other really common and popular process strategies as well, like POW or POWER. There's a lot more information on that within the self-regulated strategy development world that's certainly related to this. How to do it, teach it using exemplar text. So you can use previous year's writing samples. Teachers can model their own writing. Students love highlighting these different elements. So if you're teaching Tide, making sure everyone has access to 4 different colors and highlighting those in other people's writing, in their writing, in those exemplar paragraphs, to kind of identify those components in existing writing. And then teaching them how to align their graphic organizers to that structure. So if you are teaching a specific structure, have a graphic organizer and teach students how to create a graphic organizer that aligns to that as well. You may also use that color highlighting to kind of reinforce that alignment also. And then also related to text level pieces, kind of, and that structure piece is this is a really powerful way to make connections to reading and language comprehension. So research studies consistently show that the most effective instruction in writing should include explicit instruction at the text level. And it's really true for the informational structure in particular. None of us are born knowing informational text structure. We are evolutionary wired for narrative structures and oral language pieces, but not the informational structure like this. But we can be really effective in teaching it. So I talked about the tide structure earlier, but I do want to just point out that there are a number of other really powerful informational structures as well. Compare contrast, cause and effect, problem solution. Um, so when we teach these structures in both reading and writing, students are then able to write about something that they read, and they can use comprehension strategies to sort of get the gist or engage in that summary piece. Then they can then use that gist or that summary to create the topic sentence for their writing. So the knowledge acquisition and transformation strategy that's highlighted on this slide does just that. So students are taught a strategy. They learn how to use the structure of what they've just read, create a summary statement, and then integrate that into their writing. So this is a really, really powerful strategy. Has shown large effects in really rigorous studies on all students, but especially for students with disabilities. All right, and we're wrapping up, but just kind of a final question that comes up quite frequently is, well, where do I start with this and how do I prioritize? Particularly if you're working within the database individualization framework or intensive intervention, you may be thinking, well, my student has red X's all over their paper, or they're really struggling in all of these areas. So a couple of just things that I like to kind of share with teachers and think that these may be useful places to start. So I really do appreciate the curriculum-based measure format. So when we're creating this numeric score, because we can look at how many types of errors students are making within the sentence level or within the word level. So looking at that count data or that density of errors might point you in a direction of where you want to start with that student. I also encourage you to look for the pieces that we know and the research backs are the strongest predictors of writing proficiency. So for students in elementary school, those tend to be the students' word level accuracy, so their spelling and the complexity of the words that they're using, and that text structure piece. So again, if you're wondering where do I start, those are important places to go. And then think about if there's any low-hanging fruit or those like easy or more feasible things to add in to your practice. A lot of times I think about these as potentially being related to that transcription or subword level. So handwriting or typing fluency practice. If there are 10 minutes extra in the day that you can get a kid on a free typing program, that may be some of that low-hanging fruit. And that transcription practice will support their other writing processes as well. So again, when you're wondering what to do, thinking about the count data, what's the strongest predictor of writing outcomes in these students, and then what might be those really more feasible or low-hanging fruit pieces that won't be a huge, huge ask. Putting it together. So again, creating some of those really specific instructional goals. I don't have a ton of time to go into that today, and that could be a whole other presentation on its own, is how do we make targeted goals on this. But you can see here, this is just an example of something that you might consider in this error analysis. I've starred the two places that I want to prioritize with this student. So looking at that low-hanging fruit, the typing fluency that the student had was slower than their handwriting. And so thinking that, okay, let's have this student participate in a typing club. They're going to work on typing for 20 minutes daily for a set number of weeks. And we will monitor that with the typing fluency assessment in that online program. And then the other pattern that really emerged out of the error analysis was that word level spelling errors. So the instructional goal for that is related to teaching a spelling pattern of doubled consonants when adding those suffixes ing or ed to a base word. The student will get explicit instruction in that, they'll get practice with that, and then we can monitor it using our curriculum-based measures. So looking at how those word level errors decrease over time with correct minus incorrect word sequences. The student had a few errors at the sentence level and maybe at the text level pieces, but we'll just continue practice and core support in Tier 1 instruction on both of those. But I do want to highlight that instruction should continue at the text level and the sentence level, even though we're focusing our intervention targets at these other levels as well. So just a final note, a lot of information in this webinar today. So if there are a couple things that you take away from this, remembering that error analysis can be really powerful in moving from that scores to skills. And I hope that you were able to see how we moved in that error analysis to identifying those skills that can be taught in instruction. The levels of language piece as being a really powerful framework for identifying those errors, both in the assessment process, but then also connecting that to what you actually teach. And then how you can prioritize and develop goals based on that. So I'm going to pass it over to Paul for the next slide.
Thank you very much, Katie, for such a great presentation. We'll continue to look at questions in the chat. And Katie, if you could actually look at the Q&A window while I discuss this, we'll get ready to try to get those questions in before the end of the hour. So here, I just wanted to briefly preview an upcoming NCII resource. It's nearly ready to be published. It's based on the work of Dr. Valentine and her colleagues, and it's a step-by-step guide that goes along with the process that Dr. Valentine shared today about how to use levels of language to identify those errors, and as she indicated, how they can be used to how teachers can make instructional changes based off of that. So please make sure that you're signed up for the NCII newsletter to receive updates when this error analysis resource is published and available, as well as receiving updates on all new NCII resources and events. We'll also share a link to remind everyone of the previously held webinars on error analysis for reading and student math work. Those recordings and slides are also available to view and download. Dr. Valentine, if you could advance to the next slide just for a moment. Wanted to share the event survey before we answer those questions. As Kat just said, with the link in the chat, please fill out the survey to help improve events. We do take your feedback and use it to improve future webinars. And now I believe we have some time for questions. There's several in here, Katie. One about up to what grade for explicit teaching in handwriting and typing, and then it's also some questions around the CBM measures.
Great. Excellent. Yeah, there's so many great questions. We'll see what we can get to in here. So for that explicit instruction in handwriting and typing, so glad you asked. There's not a set grade level, but I think the general consensus within the research is that we need to be paying attention to this a lot later than we typically do in practice. So certainly beyond second grade, when a lot of transcription practice kind of fades away. But even into middle school and high school, particularly for that typing piece, there's very, very little explicit instruction happening in typing even in today's age where kids are constantly on their Chromebooks and doing a lot of computer-based work. There's very little time for that. So if there are opportunities to build that into your regular practice, your school day, that's something that could be really, really helpful. I would say even up till, eighth, ninth grade. Um, let's see. Where can we obtain the curriculum-based measures that you referenced? Good question. There are a number of different I presented a couple of different options out there. I'm trying to think about ones that are freely available. So the kind of gist of the CBM assessment world is that especially for the purpose of the error analysis like this, you can create your own measure, right? You can have a student write in response to an article or a certain prompt for 3 to 5 minutes, and then engage in a scoring method, and you can use that to kind of compare their results with their own growth over time. So if you're using it like that, just creating your own is a feasible option. The Early Writing Project is a really excellent resource if you're working with those younger kids, K through 3. And then my work has been on the Writing Architect version. I did not link to that in this presentation, but please feel free to email me if you'd like more information. But do know that this sort of CBM family is meant to be in this like flexible assessment piece, and it's really about those scoring procedures that are used on that. So this again, we could have gone into so much more depth, and maybe we can do another presentation on what that looks like in the future. But lots of resources out there if you're just new to this, start looking for that curriculum-based measure in writing piece. Let's see, I'm just trying to read through these. How often should this error analysis be conducted? Good question. So if you're familiar with reading and kind of looking at this database individualization process within reading, that growth in reading tends to happen a lot more quickly than we see in writing. And so right now, my recommendation for the writing piece, if you're doing it as an individual piece, you can engage in this. There's no set number of times or frequency for it, but I don't think you need to be doing it every week. You're not really going to see growth from week to week necessarily in writing. It's a big process, but if you're working on a much more discrete skill, like just spelling, you might consider looking at just the students' increase in their spelling skills more frequently. So, kind of a wordy answer to that, but if you're looking at overall writing growth, let's say looking at it at the end of each instructional unit, so maybe that's 6, 7, 8, 9 weeks. And if you're looking at a really much more smaller skill, a discrete skill like spelling, you could be monitoring that more frequently, just to kind of understand that student's individual growth. Let's see, are we coming up on time, Paul?
We are at
Okay.
time, so I would like to thank you, Dr. Valentine, for this great presentation. I added Dr. Valentine's email to the chat, so please grab that before you go if you have additional questions. And thank you to everyone for starting to fill out our evaluation. And thank you for being here today for this webinar on error analysis in student writing.